Welcome to the second and final module of Resource Management Training for the Michigan Department of Education School Meals Program. The next area we will look at is paid lunch equity. The intent of paid lunch equity is to ensure that paid lunch prices are sufficient to cover the costs of paid meals or otherwise provide enough funds to support paid meal costs. MDE will gather your PLE documents. We will calculate your PLE and verify your calculations. We will then determine if the SFA raised paid lunch prices, if that was required, and verify that you submitted your most frequently charged paid lunch price. Question 707 of the off-site questionnaire asks, did the SFA charge the minimum target paid lunch price at all sites or use the USDA paid lunch equity tool to evaluate its paid lunch prices? You can answer this as not applicable if you participate in the Community Eligibility Provision Program, or CEP. Question 708 asks, did the SFA use non-federal funds to support its paid lunch prices? And question 709 asks, did the SFA increase its paid lunch prices if the paid lunch equity tool indicated an increase in the paid lunch price was required? If question 709 does not apply to you, please note that in the comments. Most common findings in the area of PLE is not using the PLE tool, pricing adult meals too low, or using the PLE tool but not complying with it when it indicates a price increase is required. If the PLE tool does indicate a price increase is required, and for some reason the SFA would like to not raise prices, they can request a waiver from MDE. Allowable and unallowable non-federal sources in support of PLE. You are allowed to use funds provided by outside organizations in support of your paid lunch equity prices. However, unallowable sources include any in-kind contributions that are converted to direct cash expenditures, and also per meal reimbursements for breakfast from any states, counties, school districts, or others. The next section is revenue from non-program foods. Non-program foods include a la carte items, including milk and second entrees, adult meals, and any items purchased with nonprofit school food service account funds for vending machines, fundraisers, school stores, or catered or vended meals. The intent is that all food that is sold in a school and purchased with funds from the nonprofit school food service must generate revenue at least equal to the cost of such foods. We will use the revenue from non-program foods risk indicators to identify risk of noncompliance. The first question in the section, revenue from non-program foods, asks, did the SFA have a system or process in place that allows it to separate its non-program food revenue from its program food revenue? This refers to the adult meals, catering, vending, and a la carte items revenue. The revenue for each of those should be tracked separately from revenue for student payments for reimbursable meals. The next question asks, did the SFA have a system or process in place that allows it to separate its non-program food costs from its program food costs? If you're not separating food costs between program foods and non-program foods, then you will have to mark this question as no. That is the case for many SFAs. Question 713 asks, did the SFA use the USDA non-program food revenue tool or a USDA-approved alternative method to assess its compliance with the revenue from non-program food requirements? This tool is available on our website. If it was not used, you will need to mark no here. Question 714 asks, did the SFA generate at least as great a share of total revenue from non-program foods as non-program foods contributed to total food costs. You notice the calculation for the revenue ratio in the bottom of question 713. So question 714 is asking if that math works out. You'll want to start with your non-program food revenue and divide it by total program and non-program food revenue. This will give you the percentage that non-program food revenue is for total revenue. Then you will take non-program food costs and divide that by total food costs for both program and non-program foods. Again, you'll get a percentage. The revenue percentage should be equal to or greater than the cost percentage. If this is true, then you can answer question 714 as yes. If it is not true, or you are not able to do the calculation because you do not separate your non-program food cost from program food cost, then you will answer this question as no. Question 715 asks, if the SFA's calculation showed that the proportion of non-program food cost was greater than the proportion of non-program food revenues, did the SFA sufficiently increase its non-program food prices to ensure compliance with the federal requirements? This question is asking that if that math did not work out and showed that your costs were greater than your revenues, did you then raise prices in an effort to increase revenues to a point where they are equal to or greater than costs? In the event that your SFA has a comprehensive on-site review, MDE must gather appropriate documentation. The information we must gather includes food costs of your reimbursable meals, food costs of non-program foods, revenue from non-program foods, and total revenue. The MDE reviewer will check that you, the SFA, included all appropriate non-program food revenues and costs in your figures. In order to determine compliance, MDE will check non-program food revenue tool or the alternate mechanism used and calculate the revenue ratio and the food cost ratio for the SFA. The revenue ratio is calculated as non-program revenue divided by total of program revenue and non-program food revenue. Food cost ratio is determined as the cost of non-program foods divided by the total of the cost of program foods and cost of non-program foods. Setting adult meal prices. MDE has a tool to help us set adult meal prices. Adult meal prices are based off from the highest paid student lunch price or student meal price, and then must add back value of commodity foods, value of a paid student, and sales tax. Most common findings and best practices in this area. Not utilizing full commodity value received is a common finding, as is pricing your adult meals too low. Non-program food revenues not being separated from program foods. Non-program foods priced too low or not using the non-program food revenue tool. Cost of non-program foods being undeterminable. Non-program food costs not being separated from program food cost. The SFA not having a sufficient process in place to accurately and thoroughly assess compliance with revenue from non-program foods. Not all revenues being recorded. Having unallowable expenses charged to the program. Commodity values not being shown as a revenue and expense, and varying revenue and expenses between your statement of activity and the FID or school meals report reported to the state of Michigan. While MDE is awaiting further guidance from USDA to address the issue of SFAs not separating costs between program foods and non-program foods, MDE will ask for your method of pricing a la carte items. SFAs that are using a standard markup percentage or a standard percentage of food cost can then use this information to determine an estimate of food costs for non-program foods. The last area in the resource management review is indirect costs. The intent of monitoring this area is to ensure that SFAs are correctly determining if costs are allowable, allocable, and appropriately charged as a direct or an indirect cost. Direct costs are those that are incurred specifically for a program or other cost objective. They are clearly identifiable to that program. Indirect costs are incurred for the benefit of multiple programs, functions, or other cost objectives. They are not readily identifiable. These costs cannot be exclusively attributable to the school meals program and should generally be treated as indirect costs. Here are some examples. Direct costs include the wages and salaries of food service workers, the cost of the food purchase, food service supplies, promotional marketing materials for food service, etc. Indirect costs include payroll services, human resources, workers' compensation, electricity, gas, sewer, trash, and the superintendent's office. Every SFA receives an indirect cost rate that is approved by the Michigan Department of Education on an annual basis. The maximum allowable rate is 15% for public schools. It is 10% for non-public schools. Every year, MDE has a report that is published that will show the rates for your SFA. You should use the unrestricted rate. However, keep in mind, if it is in excess of 15%, you're only allowed the maximum 15%. This indirect cost rate is then applied to the direct cost base, which is the sum of all your allowable costs, or your FIT or school meals program's expenditures subtotal. That is all allowable costs to the food service program, but does not include food costs, capital outlay, and contracts exceeding $25,000. To clarify that, the first $25,000 of each contract may be included in the calculation of the direct cost base. Your indirect cost rate can be found on the website michigan.gov/school nutrition by doing a search for indirect. There will be a report that says indirect cost rates in Michigan, and you'll want to choose the indirect cost rate summary for the appropriate year. Other calculation methods, you can simply use a general ledger summary or detail information for Fund 25, but again must back out unallowable items. That is, items that are unallowable for the purposes of indirect cost calculation, food, capital outlay, and contracts exceeding $25,000, as previously mentioned. There is only one question in the area of indirect costs. Were indirect costs charged to the SFA's nonprofit school food service account? If your SFA has a comprehensive review, then MDE will look at the approved indirect cost rate agreement. We'll also look at financial statements and accounting records. If you were charging indirect costs for a prior year, then we will need to see the accounting records that support that. Most common findings in this area include indirect cost calculations being done improperly, indirect costs not being charged consistently, or the indirect cost calculations not being available. Thank you for joining us. This is contact information for further questions regarding resource management. for both myself and also the general contact information for School Nutrition Programs Unit. This concludes your resource management training.